Welcome to Evolving Ideas. I'm Elaine Smitha. I'm in the Hotel Monaco, downtown Seattle, with Philip Martin, who has authored a book called Zen Path Through Depression, and here it is. This is what it looks like. And he's been through a depression himself and has learned ways to help himself. And I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion because in the Pacific Northwest we have a high incidence of depression because of the weather. So join me in welcoming Philip Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for coming and visiting with me about your new book. This is your first book.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And it's a pretty handsome book. It's got a great cover.
They did a beautiful job on it. I really like what they did when they did.
You're lucky.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd like to start with, what does this mean? What does it mean to be depressed? You're a psychiatric social worker, and you have you worked with patients in this capacity dealing with depression? So what are some of the characteristics of depression? I mean, they may be things other than what we perceive them to be. Mm-hmm. So what do you say?
Well, as I wrote the book, I tried to keep in mind just how serious depression can be. I think a lot of people tend to think of depression as just the blues, and as someone and I were just talking the other day, and we said, well, there's kind of depression with a capital D and depression with a small d. And we're talking about a depression in particular that's a clinical medical condition. It includes symptoms such as loss of appetite, a weight gain or loss of interest in things that used to give us pleasure, perhaps oversleeping or not being able to sleep enough, feelings of worthlessness and helplessness, and at its worst, preoccupation with suicide and actual suicide attempts. So I try to say, just to put it in perspective, that we need to remember it's a fatal illness. As I've gone around and spoken, I've had people come up and say to me they've just lost friends to this illness. So people both can die because they may choose to end their own lives, or I think the other thing is we may not be paying enough attention to our daily life, and it makes it difficult to do the basic tasks, and people can end up in car accidents and die because of this illness too. Mm-hmm. So it's a devastating illness.
Mm-hmm. I think that there are some who might not want to categorize it as an illness. In the medical paradigm, there are certain trigger words that conjure in the mind of the average individual certain nemesis for conditions that are very debilitating. Illness, what does that really mean? Dis-ease, but we use the word dis-ease not in the context in which I think it was originally created, dis-ease, which simply means out of ease, and creating some kind of a label that automatically gets you medical benefits. Mm-hmm. So, to me, it's more of an attitude that we are in charge of. This is a self-induced condition based upon our perceptions of life that enhance an attitude that we have about ourselves. In that context, I could say it's dis-ease because we're out of ease with who we are. But sometimes the labeling gets to be the handle that people use as an excuse for not doing anything about it.
Mm-hmm. But I think the danger sometimes is having people take too much responsibility for something that may, to some degree, be out of their hands.
But how can you say, how can you say that it's out of their hands when it's actually our perception over which we have charge?
Well, I certainly agree with what you're saying, that it's a matter of perception, but I think there are conditions much like cancer and multiple sclerosis that there again, there are some very specific things that take place within the body. Certainly how we decide to relate to them, what our attitude is towards our life in general may make us more likely to have those conditions come up.
Exactly.
But I think that sometimes we go, people need to be willing to let themselves a little bit off the hook with depression. And most of the people I've talked with have talked about the fact that there seems to be, in addition to the mental attitude, the kind of psychological symptoms or conditions that take place as part of the process, that there's very clearly some kind of physical process at work too. With the loss of appetite, the difficulty sleeping, the way we feel.
Those are just manifestations, though, of our attitude. Are you aware, and this may be beyond your scope of knowledge base, but there is some new science out there that is saying that there is no life in the body, that it is spirit. And you probably know this from your Buddhist connections. And therefore, if there is no life in the body, and when my mother died, you know, I had to go take her rings off of her fingers while the body was still warm. And of course, I never had that experience before, but when I looked at her body, my mother was not there. That body was not my mother. And that was a profound moment for me, because then I realized there was no life in the body. It's our spirit. So if indeed there's no life in the body, then everything that we are imbuing the body with is a matter of our spiritual understanding, which then takes away the blame for the body's acting up and places a responsibility on ourself. The onus is now, what are we doing with our spirit? So in that, this is the new science that's coming out, and it places a responsibility on the individual instead of making the medical associations responsible for making you well, when it all happens in your mind anyway.
And that, interestingly enough, certainly jibes with the understanding of Buddhism, which has been true for about 2,500 years, that we pretty much are nothing but mind, and that even the body and even mind itself is nothing but a dynamic process. That they would take it one step further and even argue that there isn't any specific thing that you can call soul or spirit, that even that is all nothing but dynamic process.
I like that. Well, since this is about depression and your own rejuvenation back into life, I'd like to hear about your depression. What was your experience with this?
It was an interesting experience for me, having come from having worked as a psychiatric social worker, because I, as well as a Buddhist practitioner, I had encouraged people who were dealing with depression themselves not to try and be too hard on themselves, not to let themselves fall into the trap that usually comes up with the illness, because there is so much this sense of worthlessness, of blaming oneself for everything. I mean, you tend to blame yourself for if it's a cloudy day, not only your own circumstances, but everything around you. You feel very worthless, and it's too easy, I think, for people to say, because they have the depression, that's another thing that makes them less than valuable and worthless.
So you're saying low self-esteem?
And
not feeling worthy.
Kind of going to an extreme of responsibility beyond, you know, we say we need to take responsibility for our lives, but sometimes we take responsibility for things that aren't even part of our life. You take on so much in this
guilt and shame
cycle
and all
of
that.
guilt and self-blame.
And being responsible for other people and for their attitude and their behavior, which nobody has any control over anybody else's behavior. But we assume it, don't we?
We do. So, you know, I guess just as an aside, I think that for me, wisdom is a matter of becoming more and more aware of what things you do not have control over. Oftentimes the things that we believe we have control over, we don't. And the things that we don't believe we have control over are the few things that we do. But anyway, I began slowly sliding into a depression without even being aware of it.
Well, but there's something triggered it.
It was, it took place at a time when I was making some big changes in my life. But I was reaching after some things that I had always wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. Was this a job change, a relationship change?
It was a job change. I had gone from half-time, or from full-time to half-time. I chose to stay home with my little boy, who was 2.5 at the time, and to really get involved in parenting him, which I later came to find was, I think particularly for men, a rather isolating time.
Just look at how many women have this.
Yes, I think...
Your compassion went out right at that point.
Well, the research, I think, even shows that stay-at-home moms are about 50% more likely to go through depression. And that may not have been the case in the past. I was just discussing with someone that the other day, and they said, you know, it may have been that when mom stayed at home before, everybody else on the block was staying at home. They had coffee clutches, they could make connection, and that seems to be missing from everybody's life these days, but I think it's even more isolating when you're a stay-at-home parent. And perhaps a little more for men. We don't know how to make connection that well. Men tend not to in our society. And even some of the men that were the few that I knew that were choosing to stay at home, it was difficult to get us together. So I think there was, that may have been part of the precipitating factor, was that loneliness that goes along with it, and the sense, interestingly enough, that when you are choosing as a man to stay at home, that you're doing something wrong.
Oh? If you choose it to be right for yourself, how could it be wrong?
Well, you certainly have to deal with a lot of conditioning that
social consciousness.
Yes, and it's not only that well, always, I guess I figure most crucial is that which you've absorbed yourself and believe, some of the myths of society. But you also certainly get a lot of it from outside. That there's this a struggle that I went through of, though it was what I wanted. I also had been taught and heard for years and years that a father's job, a man's job, was to provide for the family, to go out and work. And
that's the role playing.
Yes. Somehow you were less than a man if you were staying home. And interestingly enough, my wife had a similar experience, but the flip side of it. She said it was a sense she had that she was supposed to be the one staying at home with our son.
And then she was feeling guilt. Reversing roles. So what did you experience, Philip?
I began to lose interest in the things that I was doing that had given me pleasure before. I had a hard time taking pleasure in my son, in the books that I used to like to read. Part of the thing that happened was I seemed to have difficulty being able to focus my attention on things as I used to. It was difficult just to get through the day and do the tasks that I needed to perform. I went through a period of wanting to just kind of hide out. Felt tired all the time and wanted to sleep a lot.
We have that a lot here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, we have it in Minnesota. It's called November, in December usually.
Yeah, well, do you know, as of this taping, is like 90 days of rain since the 1st of November.
Just this morning, the cab driver who gave me a ride said something about, I wake up in the morning and I feel good, and I looked out the window and I just got depressed.
Yeah, it can do that because we don't have the sunshine to lighten this up. So you're choosing to stay at home with your child made you feel depressed. So did you feel at that point that you were not doing your role, that you should be out there in the marketplace? And the job that you had, was it gratifying to you, or were you still seeking more gratification? I
think I was, in hindsight, I was seeking something more.
So before you ever made the decision to go at home, then you were still, at that point you were feeling unfulfilled.
Yes.
So it was really that precipitated it more than your choice to go home and stay with your child.
Yes.
To be a house husband. So what did you do then to pull yourself out of this? What was there's usually a peak moment, a decision at a point at which you make a turnaround? What was your moment of realization?
For me, the moment came, and I think this was such an instructive lesson in what I've tried to do to be helpful to other people. Some people spoke to me, they were frustrated, they were angry, they had expectations that talking with me about their concerns would kind of break through I was denying what was going on. I just became more angry and irritable and would argue with people and almost say, well, I'm doing perfectly fine. I'm very happy. Can't you hear that in my voice?
No.
Nothing could have been further from the truth.
You least of all could recognize it.
Well, there's the additional problem, I think, of being a mental health professional, where some
Yes.
of you feel you should be able to have avoided this in the first place.
You bet.
And I actually found that there was less compassion and understanding, I think, within the profession for those of us who were going through this.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment for me really came one morning as I was trying to get Joe ready for daycare. He had to go for a couple of hours so I could go to work for half a day. And as I said, things were very hard for me to do. It took a lot of concentration and attention just to pull together what we needed to do to get out the door. And I know I had kind of a scowl on my face that was more about just it took so much to do what the tasks that were at hand. And Joe just kind of stopped in the middle of his breakfast and said, "Daddy, are you not happy?" And just hearing that in such a loving way from him, in such a guileless way, it was innocent, there was nothing he expected me to do because of it. He was just expressing his love and concern. And that was the thing which could kind of slide underneath the radar of my denial and got through to my heart and let me begin to see what really was happening and where I was and that I needed to get some help.
I can see where a 2.5-year-old hitting the target without a degree from the university. I know. Suddenly you're sitting there and you say, whoa, I mean, if my 2.5-year-old recognizes this, why can't I see it?
Yes.
Everybody else, why is it everybody else can see it, including your child? So that had to come as quite a shock.
Yeah, it was, and it was, immediately I could sense the relief in beginning to accept what was happening. Because as I talk in the book, I think so often when we are experiencing pain or difficulties in our life, we tense up, whether it's physical pain, something you really get to see firsthand in a meditation practice, that the pain that comes in your knees from sitting for a long period of time, in and of itself is not difficult. It's what we do with it by wishing it would go away and tightening up our bodies until we're just one whole white knuckle, and you can't let that. We're holding on to that pain so tightly that we protect around it and make our whole body pain rather than just the pretty minor thing that's going on in our knee. And I was doing some of that with the depression. I was having to work so hard to try and push it aside that being able to let go of that and just let it be what it was so freeing and such a relief.
So what did you do at that moment when your child asked you that? I mean, did you give him a hug and say, "My God, you're wise"?
I think I got a little teary and I said, "Sweetie, you're right, and I think Dad's going to do whatever he needs to do to get so that it doesn't have to be this way, and I'm sorry I haven't seen it before."
Did you give him a big hug?
I did, yeah.
Children have a way of touching us at our heartstrings, don't they? And they're terribly perceptive. They don't have to have a college education to recognize.
No, not at all.
They're really very smart. We don't give credit to those children for that, do we?
No, and they are so heartful, I think, as you say. That's, as people have asked me what advice I would give to family members who are worried about someone who's going through a depression. It's the lesson that I learned from that is that the most important thing you can give is just to love the person and let them know you're concerned about them, and you don't have to do it in a way that makes them feel you have any expectations on them. Just to be there as unconditionally as you can is what people need. It's what all of us need at any time, really. But
you need a friend who's just willing to be there with you and to love you through your process, because that's really what it is. It's a process, isn't it?
And a friend of mine, fairly early on, as I was sharing, he's pretty wise, and he could pick up on all the feelings I had of self-blame and the fact that I was not of enough worth because of this depression. He said, Phil, I love you even when depressed.
He sees your spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So your involvement with Buddhism, did that originate at that point, or had you been involved with it before that?
No, I'd been involved with Buddhism since my college days. I read a book called Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism, a very kind of obtuse, complicated book. But even through that, for me, the very basic teachings of Buddhism came through, and they just resonated so much with my experience and made so much sense to me that I started practicing a short time afterwards and had been for the 20 years preceding my depression.
But at that moment when you had your depression, you were not employing the teachings in your life.
I think I was trying to employ them. I think you can employ those things in a way that isn't the most useful. What I think of it as is, here in my fear and my haste to get away from what I was going through, I was. It's that paradox of what I was doing was trying as hard as I could to let go.
That's not possible. That's a tug of war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
with yourself.
It's something that's doomed to failure. You won't be able to succeed at it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the other thing that began to happen, was I could begin to have some acceptance and stop that trying so hard. And it took a little while, because the other thing that that began to happen initially was I thought I didn't feel that I could bring my depression into my spiritual practice. I think, so often people don't, they feel that there are certain things that spiritual practice is for and others that they're not.
Oh my, so it's not a consuming spiritual practice that encompasses every attitude and every facet of the human being?
Well, I think it certainly is.
But you were not viewing it? Was it that your personal view was not including it?
I think it was a personal view at the time. It's also a view that a lot of people have.
Really?
I've heard friends in 12-step programs talk about how a lot of their learning experience is that they continue to let go of the areas that they think God is not interested in their lives. That they can, I will give this problem over to God in prayer, but God is not really interested in helping me with my job, or God is not interested in helping me with my religion, or my relationship, I should say. And of course, what they continue to find is that what they need to do is continually expand their idea of what God is interested in and what their higher power is willing to help them with.
That's very selective. Perhaps it is in the use of the term God that we have a problem. Maybe if we substituted the word God and used spirit, which is a totality. The spirit is always interested in every facet of who we are. Therefore, you could work on the total rather than trying to assign certain things to a term that is nebulous to many people, because you can't see it, touch it, feel it, kind of identity. And we've been taught so much to put it on an altar and to leave it there and go about your life, and you only come to church on Sunday, and there's God. And sometimes you can't even make it out to the parking lot before you've already gone back to your old behavior. So, but if we were to imbue the body with the Spirit and know the Spirit is always with us, is always concerned with us, would that not be helpful in terms of resolution of some of these conflicts?
I think so. But as you say, it's such a common, it may be partly that we need to go against what is for some reason a natural human tendency to compartmentalize our life. That, as you say, you go to church on Sunday, and it's so easy for people to forget that devotion to God and what they want to do with giving their lives over to Spirit is something that it's not a one day a week kind of thing.
Well, that's true, but then that's conditioning. We've been very carefully taught to do that. So what you're really suggesting is we just kind of throw that all out and start all over again, and, stir up the batter again and start off with a whole new cake. And not to be slicing it up, because we are all part of the whole.
Yes. And I think I see people within Buddhist practice, and there it's an idea rather than on Sunday that you go and your religion fits into that little pigeonhole, but it's more while you're sitting on your cushion is the time for meditation and the time to bring your life and the practice alive, and that you let it go the rest of the time then. And it's, in some ways I suppose partly it's, in one way it's harder, in another way it's easier, but it's that sometimes it feels easier to say I'm going to compartmentalize my life, and I'm not going to try and bring Spirit into my life in every moment.
I too have been through a depression, and I can recognize the characteristics that you were speaking of. And but I kind of have gone a different way, because I recognize now that I am the sum total of all my experiences and the sum total of all of my choices. And therefore there is no dichotomy. There can be no separation. And I feel at this time that I am simply a walking meditation. I don't have to be any place to meditate. I am at any moment accessing that level of awareness with the Spirit that I can call on at any time, and it's always there. It's always there. And I find great counsel in that. And now I don't have the segmentation, the departmentalization of attitudes and feelings and say, oh, it's only appropriate. Now anything is appropriate at any moment. And so the stress is released. You don't have that anymore. And even there is a saying that I've heard about, kill the Buddha. And you want to talk about that? I mean, this is kind of your field.
Yeah, well, that's the idea behind that is that if the Buddha becomes something that you have conceptualized or compartmentalized so much that you can't continue to make the teachings of Buddha actualize those in every moment of your life, then you need to kill that Buddha too. It's also similar to the idea that Buddhism, or Buddha himself sometimes said that the things I teach are just like a raft. You use them to get across the shore, and by the time you get across the shore, you don't need the raft anymore. You don't carry it on your back everywhere you go.
I like that. We don't have to portage our raft all the way through the forest of insecurities, right?
Well, as we used to say in the 60s and 70s, when you get the message, you hang up the phone.
I like that. That's very good. That is very good. I like that a lot. Well, you also talk about doing nothing to begin the healing rather than fighting or running. So what can you add to that?
Well, I think comes back to this sense we have that we create so much of the suffering that we feel in the depression because we're fighting against it, trying so hard to get away from it.
But then you want to surrender?
It's a kind of surrender. It's also a kind of, as I describe it, curiosity. It's being willing to stop. And I think the meditation practice is just such a nice image, because it too is about sitting down and being willing to be still and let whatever come up wash over you, so that you're willing to face whatever comes your way. And so for me, that stopping and the surrender is an act of being willing to be with the depression and accept it and begin to investigate it and see what it may have to offer.
So would you say to somebody, who says they're depressed, or you reckon, you say, well, okay, so you're depressed. All right, so where do we go from here? This would be stopping the train, wouldn't it? Taking reassessment and say, okay, well, you're a train, I see, yeah, okay, so now what? Where do we go? What track do we take? What's our destination?
And even, I'd argue before that it's so crucial to stop the train that sometimes the mistake we make is the train's still running, and we're saying, which track do we take? How do we get out of this? And I think sometimes that there's a way in which trying to understand something gets in the way, first of all, of our just experiencing it and being willing to see what's happening with it.
Okay, so it's like, why me? Why is this happening to me? Trying to understand that part?
Yes.
I think that's a good one.
People can either fall into the why me, and there may be a way in which they may never fully know. I believe that there's a lot to be said for at least what Buddhist practice teaches, is that sometimes you have to be willing to just kind of be comfortable in being uncertain and not knowing. That there's this great doubt about we may never be able to truly understand what our human life really is. My teacher used to say, anything we study, we mainly study just to understand how little we actually do know about it. It's giving ourselves over to mystery is how I like to think of it.
I think acknowledging that, I know that's what I've done, it was like, well, okay, so here I am, now what? What? And I'm talking to myself, this inner dialogue, I agree with everything, So what are my choices? I can either die or I can live. The choice is mine. And coming to that place where you're willing to take a look at both sides of that. Because it's like being in the center of a scale and everything is balanced on either side. And when you're depressed, it's all downhill.
Oh, yes. It's so easy to go into thinking in extremes, too. I mean, I think that's a human tendency, but it seems to be aggravated in depression.
And enhanced by this low self-worth. Yes. I think that's really part of it. And I do think that depression makes us acutely aware of our mortality.
I only half-jokingly say that there are a lot of things that depression gives us that some people go to teachers or meditation retreats for years to try and get. That it in some ways gives us a more realistic view of life. When we feel that it gives us a sense of our own mortality and a taste of the fact that all things are impermanent, all things will die, then we're faced with the choice, which is the only real choice that we've been avoiding for so long, is given that truth, what are we going to do? Are we going to still love this world that's only temporary, that's only on loan to us? Or are we going to continue to try and evade that fact and act as though it's not true? It's the choice. I think I've heard people sometimes say they feel after they've lost a good friend to death as they go through that period of not wanting to get close to anyone again, which is, I think...
You're afraid of being hurt again?
And of course you may never be hurt again that way, but you'll also never feel any joy or any real connection. So that sense we have of impermanence and death in depression can be that teacher to remind us how precious everything is, and that we need to not miss our lives because we're trying so hard to avoid that unpleasant fact.
You have a lot of practices in your book, disciplines that people can do to modify their behavior and to find some answers for themselves. I haven't really gone through all of those, but do you ever consider, say, looking at nature and going through the seasons and how the seed sprouts, it gives up its fruit, and then it withers away only to come again? Do you ever use that in terms of a meditation or a process of understanding that we as human beings flower and also go through this process?
I, in fact, have a meditation that's specifically about that, that begins with, first of all, noticing our breath at the very simplest, most basic level, how our breath rises and falls. And then to watch thoughts and how they rise and fall, how an itch kind of comes into being and disappears again. And then I think it's important that we be aware that those cycles exist in the larger world outside of us. And I think we can, one thing now that we've all seen that's kind of a cultural metaphor is that time-lapse photography of flowers blooming. And I think that we see them bloom and die, and then another one take its place, and when you see that repeatedly, that's all life is about, is those cycles of things coming and going and rising into being and falling away.
Mm-hmm. I think on a larger scale, it's if you can get to the point where you realize that we're here for only a certain time, because humans so far have not been able to outlive, the longest. Even now they're marveling at how many people are over 100 years old, but I think this is going to increase. But why don't we live longer? And then for myself, it's like, well, what am I doing here? Why am I here on this earth? What am I supposed to be doing with my life? And when I got to that point where I could say, what am I supposed to be doing? It was now projecting myself outward rather than inward onto my emotions and saying, well, if I'm meant to be doing something, what is that mission? And if this is my mission, I better get about it. So do you deal with any of that at all?
I do, and I think that that's another one of the gifts that depression can give, is that it forces you to kind of come to that crossroads in your life. If you are going to continue living in a kind of a miserable way, that you can take that scale of balances and say, if I hate my job, I'm in a relationship that makes me unhappy, and that these things probably even contribute to my being depressed, and if my choice over here is to step into the unknown and leave this job, which even though I'm miserable, though maybe I like the respect I get from it, which one is worth more to me? Mm-hmm. How do I want to make my
Where's
decision?
your joy?
And that there's a Buddhist teacher who talks about the fact that the things we find most precious and beautiful in this life are the things which are the shortest lived. That a real flower is so much more beautiful than a plastic flower because it is temporary. Mm-hmm. And it's what most of us, when we can get right down to the truth of it and accept our impermanence, we can begin, first of all, perhaps to say, I do love this life, and I wouldn't want to leave.
Start there.
But at the same time, how many of us would want to live forever?
I don't know. I figure I'm going to live to be 150, and then I'm going to renegotiate.
There is when you can, the paradox of it is that when you can get to the point that you really do accept the preciousness of life and the importance of really fully living in it, that on the one hand you do feel that there's so much to be explored and that you'll never know, that you probably could spend eternity
absolutely
exploring.
As long as you have a curious mind.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about the path, the Zen path. What is the path?
The Zen path is a path which Buddha himself laid out when he was teaching 2,500 years ago, and it includes meditation, a variety. It's called the Eightfold Path, but essentially they're broken down into three areas. One is about meditation. One is action, and including things such as the way we make our living, the kind of words we speak, how we treat others, and that also includes within that ethics. And it's an idea that they're all interrelated, that we can choose to act in an ethical way which will help us to improve our understanding, because the third part of the path is understanding. Or we can improve our understanding, and as we improve or make more whole is the best way to put it. As we have a more whole understanding of things, our behavior will naturally harmonize with that. And if we have a real understanding for the way people are, we won't treat people poorly. So it's all related together. The thing that's also exciting about it that I like is that once you've set your mind to it, once you've decided to make this step onto the path, which is a path towards joy, away from the suffering of life, there are no mistakes to be made anymore.
Well, there aren't any anyway. How could it be a mistake if you're learning from it?
But I think before we set our minds in that way, we do think so much in mistakes. And unfortunately, sometimes people think in those terms too. I was just talking with a group, and one of the people said, I needed to make a decision to take some medication for a time. And I was afraid that because I am on the path, that I might be missing an opportunity for learning by going on the medications. And as we talked back and forth, we realized that when you set your foot on the path, every direction you turn becomes part of your path. So her struggle with making a decision whether to do that, and perhaps making a decision that there was some control she needed to let go of, was a part of learning for her as well. So that there's no going backwards or making wrong turns.
Mm-hmm. So can you start anywhere on this path?
You can. Mm-hmm. And that's helpful in that it corresponds to different people's preferences, I guess you'd say. Some people are more people of action, and the way they the piece of it that they'd pull out and accentuate is service and how they behave toward other people. For other people, it's understanding, and so it doesn't throw out the kind of an intellectual approach to things, that an intellectual understanding which also includes an understanding of through our very heart and body as well, is something that's to be sought after and is important.
So first of all, they would have to become aware.
Mm-hmm.
And then they make a decision at some place on this path. But the path is really just that journey to wholeness, isn't it?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
By whatever we're calling this.
Yes.
And all the different steps that we take on this path to wholeness, all of which you've mentioned, and probably a few more.
Mm-hmm.
Reaching out to be with other people might be one.
Yes, I talk about the importance of that, especially when in depression, when it can be so isolating, that it's important to reach out both in service, but also to make connection with other people who, I think, 12-step groups have had such a wonderful teaching to offer us in the idea of people who are sharing similar struggles can be of such help to each other, that I think talking with other people who are struggling with depression as well can be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. So based upon that, we would want to get out of our house.
Mm-hmm.
We need to go someplace so that we can extend beyond the environment in which we're living. Would you also consider the possibility of changing things within the home, in your environment, in order to lighten it up and maybe rearrange the furniture, move the pictures around on the walls, or throw out some old clothes and get some new clothes? Any of these things would be taking some action on regenerating some excitement about life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think doing that kind of thing in your home also tends to act on kind of a metaphoric level, I guess you'd say, that when you realize that you have to, in order to make room for new furniture in your home, you have to throw out the old furniture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It also kind of tunes your mind to the fact that in order to make room for new experiences in your life, you may have to get rid of some old ones.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I always like that approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that works. And here in the Pacific Northwest, the growing season is so wonderful when, everything is growing. Even now as I look out, my daffodils are up and they're getting ready to bloom. Even though we've had 90 days of rain, nature is still growing, still doing its thing. and still will reward us with the blossoms of its effort.
Without any, I talk a little bit about the healing power of nature in the book, and I think it's, people will say sometimes that their dog loves them regardless of what they say or do, and I think that's true. The beauty of the world outside is there for us whether we're depressed or not. And we may be choosing not to see it when we're depressed, but it's always there for us. You mentioned gardening. I think that can be such a wonderful thing, and to get people in touch with beauty, but also the cycles. My wife is a landscape designer and gardener back home in Minneapolis.
How wonderful.
She does some work with, they do a lot of work with people who are going through physical or emotional illnesses. And I know, I don't know if you've ever had anyone come here and speak with you about it, but it'd be interesting to talk about the growing movement of therapeutic horticulturalism. I think is a real neat thing that people are beginning to discover.
Well, it all has to do, I've been very familiar with art therapy in the past, and it's an extension of the same kind of thing, becoming more involved in life. And one of the things that I recognized when I was going through my own grief, which is really what depression is, really a grief, is that I looked outside. I live in a very wooded area. It's really quite beautiful. And I looked out and I thought, isn't this interesting? Nature has continued to grow. It has continued to do its thing and support me, even though I was not able to support myself. It was always there supporting me. And that almost caressing of nature around me was very humbling. And I thought, wow, this is really amazing to see that life continues, and it was always there. No matter what my thoughts were, it still was there to comfort me. And that was an extension for me to be able to project myself into another environment and feel the encircling love that exists in nature. So what you're talking about, using horticulture and this kind of thing for healing and therapy, follows that same model, doesn't it?
When you mentioned that it providing that support for you, it reminds me of something my Zen teacher used to frequently say, and that is that the world itself supports us. It's much like the salt water buoys us up when we're swimming, where we hardly even have to do anything to stay afloat. And he said if we just allow it to, we could see that life itself holds us up like the water holds us up when we're in it.
That's beautiful. Zen has a lot of wonderful statements, a lot of wonderful support.
And very oftentimes pithy, which I like. It doesn't waste words usually.
No, and you do have some things in your book here. At the end of each of the chapters, you give some exercises for people to do. You call them like further exploration, and you ask people to try some of these things to move them off their dime, so to speak. And like this one where you say, drive 10 miles per hour slower today.
I had some fun with those. I not only I tried to make them gentle, I tried to let people know that it wasn't one more thing they had to feel that they should be doing, but I also wanted people to have a little fun.
And then how do you feel about driving 10 miles an hour slower? You probably feel like life isn't moving fast enough for you, right?
It's passing you by.
It's passing me by. Look at all the cars passing you by. My gosh, it's life for sure. It's out there. Well, you have lots of chapters here, seeing without blame, and when all goes wrong, I look for the blame. I will eat that slippery morsel and look past the blame to see what really is. That's very interesting. You have some wonderful things in here, I think, for anybody who's interested in overcoming some of their depressive attitudes could find some solace by reading your book.
I wanted it to be something that could be useful even to people in the deepest, most disabling depressions, but I think it can be helpful to anyone who you say is going through any kind of grieving or difficulties.
Right.
But I think one of the things about Zen that I appreciate and that I especially got from my teacher Katagiri Roshi was that it's about really being able to engage with life, and it's a very practical thing. And so I wanted this book to not be something that people just read and stayed in their minds. I wanted them to engage their bodies and their hearts in it too, and make it as practical as possible.
Well, it needs to be applicable, that's for sure. Do you find that people can save a lot of energy by accepting the situation as they are, as it is?
Oh, I think so. It was certainly true for me, and I just was speaking to someone yesterday who said as soon as I realized it was only depression, even though it was painful and difficult, it was only depression, I no longer needed to fight against it anymore, I suddenly realized how much energy I had been putting into that fighting. So that you find some energies that you didn't even know you had within you.
Mm-hmm.
Because so often, there's so much, I think, with fighting things or fighting what is, trying to cover up the truth about things in the way we talk and act, that we waste so much of our energy that way.
Yes. Well, if we were to take, say, or you could use different analogies. You could say a pie, or you could say a bottle of energy, like a genie, and all energy is there. That we are one composite of energy, and we have, we can divide it up however we wanted to. We can put a little bit here, and a little bit there, and a little bit there. And if you have a whole lot in your depression, then you don't have any extra energy to do the other things that you really want to do. The bottle now is empty.
Mm-hmm.
It's been allocated to be in certain parts, or the piece of pie has been cut up so that there's nothing left for you to build a life on. So what we have to do, if I understand all this correctly, is to go back into that pie and say, hey, this is taking too much of my life. This is my energy. This is all. I've only got so much energy, because love and fear are the same energy. It's just where do you want to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And divide that up and say, okay, well, I'm going to take some out of that depression. I'm going to move it over here to joy. And if you kind of niggle away at this, pretty soon it's gone, and you're now revitalized and back absorbed in life.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And so you have also, you mentioned about control, having riches and control. That those are all forms of control, aren't they? Power, control, riches, that got to make it to the top kind of thing. A lot of the men are plagued with that, having to reach to the top of their profession. Does it really matter?
And if you can be honest with it, I guess I always used to tell people who would talk to me, and I could either absorb a lot of it. When I was staying home with my son, I'm thinking of, and they would say, how wonderful that you're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
How wonderful for him. And yes, it's good for him. But for me, the bottom line was I loved every second of it. That I did it for entirely selfish reasons. It changed who I was. It gave new meaning and purpose to my life, and every day was a joy. And it was just, of course, when I look at it that way, the ripples out are going to be positive for him and for everyone else too. But at bottom, it was something I did for myself.
Did that initial spurt into that self-recognition occur after your son asked you why you weren't happy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it all kind of followed after that. I had gotten very stuck and frozen up until that point.
And so what was the first thing that you did after that? What was your first step on your path back?
I began meditating in a different way. I kind of sat down and consciously invited the depression in.
Good.
And brought it to the cushion with me.
Mm-hmm.
Another step for me was realizing that I needed to take a look at some things going on in my life, and I needed to make an appointment with a good therapist and begin doing some work that way.
Well, we teachers, we were taught, right?
Mm-hmm.
So being in the field that you were in, helping other people, now you found that you needed help.
Yes. And it was difficult to accept that, but that was a good learning.
You must have had a good therapist.
He was someone who helped me too, who didn't respond immediately with fear and panic. I think I still probably had some of that, and he didn't tune into that of my feeling of, I'm here to get rid of this depression at whatever cost. He encouraged me to slow down a little bit too in the process. And he was the person who helped. He gave me the task of visualizing if the depression were a place, how I would describe it.
Very good.
And that was interesting. He didn't stick with it, but I stuck with it, and it became interesting, as I talk a little bit about in the book. Each time I would go back to that place, I began to see it change. as my attitude toward the depression changed. That initially it was a very dry desert. There was no life to be found there, and there was a deep, dark pit that was kind of bottomless in the center of this space I imagined. And in doing some visualization, I found it was helpful to write about this place, that when I would return to it, I began to see that there was more there than I originally thought, that there was some life inside that pit. There were vines growing up from the center of it, and small animals scurrying about, and finally got to the point that I realized there was a spring bubbling up from the center of it. So that helped to change my attitude toward the depression, and was also, I think, an indicator of how my attitude was changing from some other things I was doing.
Mm-hmm. And so what was the length of period of time that this happened?
It took 3 to 6 months before I really began to feel much better. And then another 6 months. The whole thing probably lasted about a year, that I was struggling with some of these issues and questions.
Did you ever think of having a garbage can and putting some of it in the garbage can? Or taking some of that and imbuing a glass of water with it and then dumping the glass of water down the sink?
I did some ceremonies with burning some of it on paper. Or I also found a helpful exercise that I had learned from a therapist I used to work with, was to, sometimes you don't, some of those things you may not need to get rid of for good, but you can also put them on a box on the shelf, that you don't have to be dealing with them all the time either. That you deserve a break occasionally too.
And then go back and pick them up at a later date, which means they haven't really been totally resolved, but it's an ongoing process, which I think is the point. This is a process. You know, life is not a destination, it's a process. And what you were experiencing was simply a process of renewal. You know, I mean, as I say a lot, change is inevitable, but growth is optional. And you simply chose that. Because you're going to have change, but how do you deal with it? You either grow through it or not.
And I sometimes think of the image of the phoenix particularly. I guess I hadn't thought about this for a while, but when I went through an ordination as a lay Buddhist with my teacher, everyone was given a name which somehow related to something he understood about you that perhaps you didn't even see.
Oh, can you just summarize, say, the book and your mission?
I guess my mission is to encourage people to find their own path through depression. I had a little quibble with the publisher. I wanted to call it a Zen Path, to say that I'm again not saying there is any one path. There are as many paths as there are people. That's what I want people to understand, and to be willing to give themselves over to this opportunity and be kind to themselves and find their own way through it and learn what's to be learned while they're doing that.
And get out of themselves and find this way. That's very good. Well, there's lots to life that needs to be experienced, and that's only one step.
Yes.
On that path. Well, Philip, I appreciate your coming through Seattle on your book tour, and that we were able to set up an interview.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Well, I've enjoyed having you too, and Seattle is really kind of a hotbed for depression. You know, I think it ranks very high in suicides because of the climate, and so it's, you know, it's a good place to have a story and a show about depression. Good. So.
Well, as I first began giving workshops, someone I did that with, who I used to work with, said, well, we need to remember the whole point is that there may be one person when we go out to speak we can help, and that's right. What we're doing this for.
Exactly, exactly. Thanks again, Philip.
Thank you.
I appreciate your coming. And to my viewers, thank you for tuning in, and join me next time when we explore another avenue of our universe and our relationship to it. I'm Elaine Smitha.